September 19, 1944. The morning air outside Arracourt carried a wet chill, the kind that clung to the lungs and dampened uniforms already stiff with mud from weeks of retreat. A pale fog settled low across the French countryside, wrapping shattered farmhouses and skeletal orchards in a veil of silence. To the men of the German 111th Panzer Brigade, the quiet was deceptive. Their Panther OSVG tanks, bristling with 75mm high-velocity guns and clad in armor sloped to deflect almost anything the Americans could field, advanced with the confidence that came from months of dominating Allied armor. Since Normandy, the sight of a Panther's long barrel had meant panic for American crews in their slower, outmatched Shermans. Here in Lorraine, the expectation was no different. A swift push would brush aside resistance, reclaim ground, and prove that the Reich's armor still dictated the tempo of war. But the mist carried something else, something the Germans had not seen before. At first it was movement at the edges of fields, a blur against the pale grass, low to the ground and deceptively small. A German gunner, later recalling that moment, described struggling to bring the Panther's heavy turret around, only to find the target already vanished into the fog. What had slipped past him was not a reconnaissance car or half-track, but a new breed of American machine, the M18 Hellcat. Designed as a tank destroyer, it did not lumber like a Sherman or crawl like a Churchill. It darted, an armored predator able to sprint across open ground at nearly 55 miles per hour, faster than any tracked vehicle the Germans had ever encountered. The Panthers, proud beasts of steel, suddenly felt clumsy. Their 45-ton bulk made traversing a turret a slow task, the hydraulics grinding to keep pace with a target that refused to stay still. From concealed hedgerows and the folds of terrain, the Hellcats appeared, snapped off rounds from their 76mm guns, and disappeared before return fire could be sighted. The Americans were not standing toe-to-toe with German armor. They were circling it, weaving around its strength, forcing the Panthers to fight on ground that no longer favored them. Survivors would later admit the disorientation was worse than the incoming fire. "It moved like a demon," one German soldier wrote, astonished that such speed could belong to a tank. For the first time, German crews understood what it meant to be hunted not by firepower alone, but by velocity. Their armor, once a guarantee of superiority, had become a liability against an enemy that refused to fight conventionally. The Hellcat could sprint across a field, loose a shot, and vanish into the mist before a Panther's commander could even bark the order to fire. In those hours near Arracourt, the battlefield tilted, and the assumption that Panzers controlled the pace of battle was shattered. Reports filtering back to German officers were met with skepticism. Surely their men were exaggerating. Surely no American machine could outpace a Panther. But the reports kept coming. Engagement after engagement told the same story. Speed had changed the equation. The M18 Hellcat's arrival marked more than the debut of a single vehicle. It embodied a new tactical idea, one born not of thicker armor or bigger guns, but of maneuver. America's answer to German heavy armor was not to match steel with steel, but to outrun, outflank, and outthink. In the fog of Lorraine, this doctrine revealed itself with startling clarity. By the time the German columns fell back, shaken less by the volume of American fire than by the sensation of being unable to keep up, the Wehrmacht faced a new and unsettling question. How do you fight an armored enemy that moves faster than you can react? The shock of Arracourt was only the beginning. To understand how such a machine came to exist, why American designers had gambled on speed as their solution to German superiority, we must look back to the origins of the Hellcat itself, and to the doctrine that chose velocity over protection as the key to survival. December 1940. Snow and mud thickened the fields of Europe, and the world watched in disbelief as German panzer divisions thundered across the continent. The Blitzkrieg, lightning war, had smashed through Poland the previous year, and now, with alarming speed, it had toppled France in mere weeks. Columns of Panzer IIIs and IVs, supported by mechanized infantry and swarms of aircraft, had not just defeated armies. They had dismantled entire strategies built on slow-moving defenses. For American observers, the lesson was undeniable. Their own armored forces, still wedded to the concept of infantry support tanks, were not ready for this new style of war. The lumbering M2 and M3 medium tanks, with tall profiles and limited guns, might have been useful for breaking infantry positions, but they were not designed to chase, intercept, or counter fast-moving enemy armor that dictated the tempo of battle. By 1941, the urgency had sharpened. Even before Pearl Harbor drew the United States fully into the war, military planners were re-examining the structure of their armored forces. The early M3 Lee, with its ungainly hull-mounted 75mm gun and secondary turret, was already outdated by the time it reached production. The M4 Sherman, introduced as its replacement, offered a better balance of mobility and firepower, but it was still conceived as a general-purpose vehicle. It could support infantry, exploit breakthroughs, and face moderate opposition, but its doctrine did not envision Shermans dueling head-to-head with concentrated Panzer assaults. That responsibility, in theory, would belong to a new breed of unit, the tank destroyers. The Tank Destroyer Command was formally established in late 1941, born out of the fear that America would face the same fate as France if confronted by massed panzer thrusts. Its doctrine was radical for the time. Instead of creating heavier and slower tanks to meet German armor in grinding battles of attrition, the U.S. Army declared that mobile gun platforms should counterattack swiftly, ambush enemy spearheads, and withdraw before the heavier German guns could bring their full weight to bear. The emphasis was clear: maneuverability over armor. These vehicles would not slug it out like heavyweights, but would strike with precision, exploiting speed and surprise as their true protection. The deserts of North Africa in 1942 hammered these ideas into sharper focus. There, American units fought their first real battles against the Arracourt, commanded by Erwin Rommel. Reports poured back from Tunisia and Libya, describing how Panzer IIIs and IVs, often supported by the dreaded 88mm anti-aircraft gun repurposed as a tank killer, consistently outmaneuvered Allied armor. British Crusaders and American Shermans were caught in ambushes, their armor pierced at ranges they had thought safe. Yet the same reports noted that when Allied units moved with agility, exploiting terrain and speed, they could blunt the effectiveness of German coordination. This reinforced the Tank Destroyer Command's conviction: speed would be America's answer, not a futile race to match German armor plate for plate. Meanwhile, ominous new threats were emerging on the Eastern Front. By mid-1943, intelligence confirmed that Germany had fielded the Panther and the Tiger. The Panther's 75-meter KWK-42 gun could penetrate most Allied tanks at over a kilometer, while its sloped armor made it nearly invulnerable from the front. The Tiger Y, with its massive 88mm KWK-36 gun and armor up to 100 millimeters thick, inspired terror in Soviet and Western crews alike. To American planners, the prospect of fighting such machines head-on seemed not only costly, but impractical. Even if U.S. industry could produce a tank to match them in armor, it would come at the expense of speed, numbers, and the logistical advantage of standardized vehicles rolling off Detroit assembly lines. Thus the solution was defined not by sheer strength, but by pragmatism. The weapon of choice would be the 76mm M1 gun, adapted from field artillery and refined for tank destroyer use. It could not reliably pierce the thick frontal plates of a Tiger at long range, but against the flanks of Panthers or the sides and rear of Panzers, it was more than sufficient. This acceptance of limitation reflected a larger doctrinal choice. The U.S. Army did not intend its tank destroyers to engage in frontal duels. They were to ambush, reposition, and strike where German armor was weakest, using their velocity as a shield against destruction. This doctrine meshed perfectly with American industrial capacity. Unlike Germany, which struggled to balance quality and quantity, the United States could design a specialized vehicle and mass-produce it by the thousands. What mattered was not invulnerability, but simplicity, standardization, and speed. The tank destroyer would be light enough to move rapidly on the battlefield, heavy enough to mount a powerful gun, and cheap enough to roll off assembly lines in overwhelming numbers. It was in many ways the embodiment of America's approach to war: leverage industrial might to create flexible, mobile tools that exploited enemy weaknesses rather than matched their strengths directly. By the close of 1942, the concept was crystallizing. The U.S. did not need another Sherman, nor could it afford to wait for a super-heavy tank project that might bog down in delays. What it needed was an armored predator, one that could hunt Panzers on its own terms. The foundation had been laid by doctrine, refined by hard lessons in North Africa, and sharpened by the looming spectre of the Panther and Tiger. The stage was set for engineers to take these theories from paper to steel, and in doing so, they would design a machine that would shock the Germans not by its weight or firepower, but by the sheer impossibility of its speed. By the summer of 1942, engineers at Buick Motor Division were finalizing a machine that looked almost fragile beside the towering steel giants of the German Panzerwaffe. Yet in its design lay a philosophy as sharp as any gun barrel, speed above all else. Officially christened the 76mm gun motor carriage M18, the vehicle would soon acquire a battlefield name more fitting of its predatory role, the Hellcat. It was not intended to outlast blows in a duel of armor and steel. It was meant to strike first, move faster, and vanish before the enemy could recover. At the core of this radical concept sat the Continental R975, a 9-cylinder air-cooled radial gasoline engine that delivered 400 horsepower. Originally derived from aircraft engines, it was compact, powerful, and proven. When paired with a new suspension adapted from the forthcoming M24 Chaffee light tank, the Hellcat's chassis achieved levels of agility no tracked vehicle of the era could match. Testing at Aberdeen. Proving ground revealed speeds on paved roads of 55 miles per hour, nearly double that of the Panther, whose practical limit was 29, and more than twice the Tiger Y, which strained to exceed 24. Off-road too, the Hellcat maintained an edge, moving with a quickness that gave its crews a fighting chance to dictate the terms of battle. This blistering speed came at a cost. Buick's engineers stripped the vehicle of nearly all but the most essential armor. Its glacis plate was just 25 millimeters thick, scarcely enough to stop anything larger than a heavy machine gun. Side armor was thinner still, often no more than 12 millimeters. Even modest German anti-tank weapons could penetrate it with ease. The turret, open-topped to reduce weight, left the crew exposed to shrapnel, mortar fragments, and the deadly rain of artillery airbursts. Survivability, therefore, was never expected to come from armor thickness. It would come from agility, surprise, and a doctrine that emphasized movement over entrenchment. The Hellcat's sting lay in its main armament, the 76mm M1A2 gun, mounted in a fully traversable turret, firing armor-piercing rounds at muzzle velocities, approaching 792 meters per second. It was lethal against Panzer IVs, even at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. Against the Panther, it could not reliably crack the thick glacis head-on, but a flanking shot against the thinner side armor often proved decisive. Tigers remained formidable opponents, yet the doctrine of the Tank Destroyer Command never intended Hellcats to engage them directly from the front. Instead, Hellcat crews were trained to exploit terrain, concealment, and above all speed, hitting where the enemy was weakest. Supporting this main gun was a single 50-caliber Browning M2 heavy machine gun mounted atop the turret. This weapon served as both anti-aircraft defense and a means to suppress infantry, giving the Hellcat some measure of close-in protection when its cannon could not be brought to bear. The vehicle's low silhouette, barely 9 feet tall, was another asset. Crews could conceal themselves behind hedgerows, rises, or even rubble, then spring from hiding with devastating velocity. Inside, 5 men operated the Hellcat as a tightly coordinated team. The commander directed the action, scanning for threats and opportunities. The gunner and loader worked in rapid rhythm to keep shells slamming into the breech and out the barrel. The driver and assistant driver, who doubled as the radio operator, gave the machine its motion and voice, maneuvering it into firing positions and ensuring communication with supporting units. In battle, survival hinged on this coordination. The Hellcat was not a vehicle for hesitation. Its greatest protection was the ability of its crew to move, fire, and relocate before the enemy's heavy guns could respond. Technical evaluations at Aberdeen during 1943 highlighted more than just performance figures. Officers remarked on the Hellcat's mechanical reliability, its ease of maintenance, and the remarkable foresight in its standardized parts. American industry, particularly Buick's Detroit plants, could produce and service the machine at scale, a critical advantage as the war stretched the logistical capacities of every nation involved. In contrast to German over-engineering, the Hellcat was simple, practical, and effective in its intended role. By July 1943, with testing completed, production orders were confirmed. Buick's factories began rolling the vehicles out in quantity, and crews across the Army tank destroyer battalions began training on them. For many, the experience was unlike anything they had known. Compared to the lumbering M10 and M36, whose heavy armor and slower speeds limited their tactical options, the Hellcat felt like a sports car with a cannon. It demanded new tactics, daring maneuvers, and the acceptance that protection came not from steel plates, but from never being where the enemy's gunfire landed. As training battalions practiced ambush drills, quick repositioning, and coordinated strikes, anticipation built. Here was a machine that embodied doctrine in its purest form, a predator of speed and maneuver, meant to shred the myth of German invincibility. With every mile per hour it could achieve, with every second it saved in repositioning, the Hellcat promised to bring a new kind of fight to Europe. Soon those promises would be tested under fire, as the M18 made its way from the proving grounds to the battlefields of Italy, and soon after, into the crucible of France. July 1944. The heat of an Italian summer hung heavy over the rolling hills and broken valleys north of Rome. Dust clung to uniforms, engines roared against winding mountain roads, and the villages scattered across Tuscany bore the scars of months of fighting. Into this landscape arrived a machine that few in Europe had yet seen, the M18 Hellcat. Assigned to the 805th Tank Destroyer Battalion, it was here, amid the narrow passes and stone-walled fields leading toward the Arno River, that the Hellcat would first test the doctrines forged in America's war colleges and proving grounds. The battalion, under the command of the U.S. Fifth Army, led by General Mark Clark, entered a theater where armored warfare was a daunting challenge. Italy's terrain was ill-suited for tanks. Roads twisted along ridgelines, valleys funneled advances into predictable avenues of fire, and German defenses bristled with anti-tank guns dug into stone terraces. The Wehrmacht deployed both Panzer IVs and Panthers along the Gothic line, counting on their armor and long-range guns to force Allied vehicles into slow, deliberate thrusts. Previous months had proven this expectation correct. Shermans bogged down in the mud of river crossings, British Churchills struggled on mountain slopes, and German gunners waited patiently to punish any armored misstep. The Hellcat changed that rhythm. From the moment the 805th rolled into action near Cesena in July, the contrast was unmistakable. Crews employed their speed as doctrine demanded, racing from one patch of cover to another, never lingering in sight for long. One report described a duel where a Panzer IV, set up to dominate a crossroads, suddenly found itself struck from the flank. The American gunfire had come from a Hellcat that had sprinted across a field previously thought impassable for armor. Within minutes, the destroyer had vanished again, leaving behind only the smoke of a crippled German tank. To the German defenders, accustomed to calculating firing angles against slower Shermans, the sudden velocity of the Hellcat was a shock. Italian civilians noticed it too. In letters and post-war accounts, villagers spoke of American tank destroyers that seemed to leap across open ground, darting from vineyards to rubble-strewn barns before their adversaries could adjust. The sight was exhilarating, but it was also dangerous. Every Hellcat carried the weight of its design compromise, paper-thin armor. A single hit from a German 75mm or 88mm gun could ignite the vehicle, turning its light frame into a burning pyre. Crews knew this. They spoke of the constant tension, the knowledge that survival depended not on steel but on reflex, coordination, and nerve. Casualties underscored the risks. In the hills south of Florence, an ambush by concealed German gunners destroyed several Hellcats in minutes, their open-topped turrets leaving no protection from bursting shells. Yet even in loss, the lessons were clear. Hellcats were not built for attrition. They were built to disrupt, to sow confusion, and to buy time for larger formations to maneuver. When used in concentrated bursts, shifting ground faster than the Germans could track, they could delay or even blunt counterattacks. Reports filtered upward through Fifth Army Command, noting both the dangers and the promise. By late summer 1944, The Hellcat's reputation was spreading. Axis intelligence initially labeled it merely a light tank with high speed, dismissing it as little more than a reconnaissance vehicle. Only after repeated clashes did they begin to appreciate the sting of its 76mm gun, capable of ripping through the side armor of Panthers when given the opportunity. To Allied commanders, the baptism in Italy had proven the concept. Velocity could serve as armor, and aggressive mobility could outwit a numerically superior enemy. The Italian campaign thus became the proving ground. Crews of the 805th gained confidence in the Hellcat's strengths and learned to respect its vulnerabilities. The doctrine of speed, so long theoretical, was validated in the crucible of battle, and as word of its success reached higher commands, plans were made to send the M18 to the broader European stage. Ahead lay the great battles of France and Germany, where the Hellcat would no longer be a curiosity, but a decisive factor in armored clashes against the Wehrmacht's best, September 1944. The fields of Lorraine lay draped in fog, a damp shroud that muffled sound and masked movement. Into this haze advanced the German 5th Panzer Army, their orders clear: smash through the thinly stretched American lines near Arracourt and reclaim the initiative in France. Panthers rolled forward with the heavy growl of their Maybach engines, their commanders certain that their thick armor and long-barreled 75mm guns would dominate any American resistance. Yet what awaited them was something entirely unexpected. From the first encounters, confusion reigned. Panther crews reported being struck not head-on, but from angles they had not anticipated. Tanks positioned to dominate crossroads or ridgelines suddenly found shells slamming into their sides. German gunners swung their turrets desperately, but the targets vanished as quickly as they appeared. In interrogation reports gathered by U.S. forces, captured German officers described machines that seemed impossibly quick, faster than reconnaissance cars, but armed like tanks, one astonished lieutenant admitted. To men who had spent years dictating the pace of armored battle, the sensation of being outmaneuvered was both novel and deeply unsettling. At first, higher German commands dismissed these reports. Accounts of American armor moving at such speeds seemed exaggerated, perhaps the product of shaken nerves or poor battlefield awareness. But as the engagements multiplied, the evidence grew harder to ignore. Intercepted intelligence confirmed the existence of a new American tank destroyer, and technical bulletins began to circulate through Panzer divisions. These bulletins noted the vehicle's unusual mobility, its reliance on speed over armor, and its effectiveness when used in ambush or rapid counterattack. Commanders were warned not to pursue it across open terrain. The Hellcat could simply outrun pursuit, repositioning faster than heavier Panzers could respond. The advice was stark: engage from long range, use terrain to restrict its movement, and avoid letting the battlefield devolve into a contest of maneuver. Meanwhile, the Americans were proving just how effective this contest could be. During the Battle of Arracourt, U.S. after-action reports recorded that Hellcats played a decisive role in destroying more than 30 German tanks over 2 weeks of fighting. Exploiting the thick Lorraine fog, Hellcat crews darted between villages and hedgerows, striking exposed flanks before slipping back into concealment. To the Germans, it felt as though the battlefield itself was betraying them. Positions once considered safe were suddenly vulnerable, and armored superiority no longer guaranteed control. The psychological effect was profound. Stories spread among Panzer grenadiers that the Americans had fielded machines that could dance across the battlefield, weaving between bursts of fire in ways that seemed almost unnatural. For veterans of the Eastern Front, accustomed to Soviet masses but not to such nimble precision, the Hellcat represented a new and unfamiliar threat. It was not merely that the vehicle could kill a tank. It was that it shattered the rhythm upon which German doctrine relied. This unease deepened as the Luftwaffe's reconnaissance confirmed industrial realities. Aerial photographs of Detroit revealed sprawling factories churning out armored vehicles at a pace the Reich could never hope to match. The conclusion was grim. The Hellcat was not an isolated innovation, but part of a broader tide. More of these machines would soon arrive, and no matter how many were destroyed in battle, American industry could replace them many times over. What had begun as battlefield reports of speed and surprise grew into a symbol of imbalance, both tactical and industrial. For the Wehrmacht, Long accustomed to dictating how armored war was fought, the experience in Lorraine marked a turning point. The shock of meeting an enemy that could outpace them, strike where they were weakest and be replaced in endless numbers, shook confidence as much as it inflicted material loss. From the stunned disbelief of Panzer crews to the sobering recognition in German intelligence summaries, the Hellcat's impact was undeniable. Its appearance in France had not only introduced a new battlefield predator, but had underscored the vast machinery of American production standing behind it. From this shock, the story turns naturally to that machinery itself, the industrial miracle that ensured the Hellcat was not a rare predator, but a mass-produced reality, ready to appear across every front where American forces advanced. In July 1943, the first production M18 Hellcat rolled off the assembly line at Buick's Flint, Michigan plant. It emerged not from an overburdened, bomb-ravaged industry, but from the intact heart of America's wartime machine. Buick, a division of General Motors, had been tasked with turning experimental designs into battlefield realities, and it delivered with astonishing speed. Over the course of just 16 months until October 1944, the company produced 2,507 Hellcats, a feat that underscored the immense industrial advantage the United States held over Germany. At peak efficiency, the Flint plant could turn out nearly 500 vehicles per month, each one the product of a meticulously coordinated supply chain that spanned the breadth of the nation. Steel from Pittsburgh, engines from Continental's factories, rubber from the Gulf Coast, and countless smaller components from subcontractors all converged on Buick's production lines. Unlike German Panzers, which often demanded unique parts, specialized labor, and prolonged finishing processes, the Hellcat was designed with interchangeability in mind. Standardized components meant that a replacement gun, engine, or suspension system could be installed with relative ease, whether in a factory or in a field workshop on the far side of the Atlantic. The design philosophy behind the Hellcat lent itself to this efficiency. Stripped-down armor and lightweight construction made the vehicle faster to build and easier to transport. Where a Panther could take weeks of careful machining, a Hellcat could be assembled, tested, and shipped in a fraction of the time. German records lamented this reality. For every Panther that crept from the Reich's increasingly strained factories, America could produce multiple Hellcats, with far less vulnerability to bombing campaigns or resource shortages. Logistics carried the story further. From Detroit, the Hellcats were loaded onto trains that carried them to East Coast ports. Their Liberty ships, the mass-produced cargo vessels that became the lifeline of the Allied war effort, ferried them across the Atlantic. Convoys braved U-boat-infested waters to deliver these machines to Naples, and later to Cherbourg, where they were unloaded and dispatched to tank destroyer battalions awaiting reinforcement. The speed of this transatlantic supply chain was remarkable. Hellcats could leave Michigan and, within weeks, be engaging German armor in Italy or France. Cost was another factor in their advantage. Each M18 Hellcat came in at roughly $5,700 in 1944 dollars, making it relatively affordable compared to the massive investments Germany poured into Tigers and Panthers. This affordability meant that battalions could be fully equipped, replacements could be ordered without hesitation, and losses could be absorbed without crippling the overall armored strength of the U.S. Army. Moreover, the logistical network did not stop at delivering new vehicles. Spare engines, guns, and track assemblies accompanied shipments, ensuring that frontline workshops could repair battle-damaged Hellcats quickly. In practice, this meant that an M18 disabled one week could often return to combat the next. German intelligence noted this with envy and resignation. Reports from 1944 acknowledged that the Americans could replace destroyed vehicles faster than the Wehrmacht could replace a single Panther. Every destroyed Hellcat was little more than a temporary setback. Every destroyed Panther was a strategic blow. The difference was not merely material but psychological. German crews faced the knowledge that even successful engagements did little to dent the tide of American armor. Back in the United States, the human element was not neglected. Even as vehicles rolled from factories, training camps across the country prepared their crews. Soldiers learned to harness speed, to fight according to the new doctrine that emphasized mobility and ambush. By the time Hellcats reached the front lines, They were manned by crews who had practiced dashing from cover to cover, drilling in the coordination that survival required. The industrial machine of America was thus more than a foundry of steel. It was a factory of confidence. From the humming assembly lines of Detroit to the ports of Europe, the Hellcat embodied the convergence of doctrine, industry, and logistics. It was not just a weapon, but a demonstration of the Allies' ability to outproduce, outsupply, and outmaneuver their enemies. Having proven its worth in Italy and stunned its foes in Lorraine, the Hellcat was now poised to etch its record across the broader European battlefield, where its reputation as the fastest armored predator of the war would be cemented. By late 1944, the M18 Hellcat had already made its presence felt in Italy and Lorraine. But it was during the bitter winter battles of December, as snow blanketed the Ardennes, that its reputation was burnished into legend. When German forces launched their surprise offensive through the forests of Belgium, the Allies scrambled to contain the blow. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division dug in to hold the vital crossroads town. Alongside them, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion arrived with its complement of Hellcats, vehicles untested in such harsh winter conditions, but soon to prove indispensable. The Ardennes offensive placed immense pressure on the thin American lines. German armor, including Panthers and Tiger IIs, pressed relentlessly to cut off Bastogne. In response, the 705th used its Hellcats in exactly the manner doctrine prescribed, as swift predators darting from cover to cover, intercepting armored thrusts before they could gain momentum. In freezing winds and snow-choked roads, crews kept engines running through the night to ensure their machines would start at dawn. From barns, hedgerows, and forest tracks, Hellcats emerged suddenly, unleashing armor-piercing rounds into advancing Panzers before disappearing once more into the woods. American after-action reports credited the battalion with destroying dozens of German tanks and armored vehicles during the siege. More importantly, their speed allowed them to shift rapidly between threatened sectors, plugging gaps that otherwise might have been exploited. This ability to be everywhere at once gave the defenders of Bastogne time to endure, until Patton's Third Army arrived to lift the encirclement. For the German attackers, the experience was maddening. Accounts describe armored columns expecting to overwhelm lightly held positions, only to be ambushed by vehicles that struck and vanished before a countershot could be fired. Panzer crews complained of fighting ghosts that appeared without warning, a phrase that captured the growing sense of futility when facing the Hellcat. The campaign in the Ardennes proved the Hellcat's adaptability. It was not confined to sunny fields or the open terrain of Lorraine. It could fight just as effectively amid snow, mud, and dense forest. In January 1945, as the Allies counterattacked into Alsace, Hellcats again demonstrated their value. During the reduction of the Colmar Pocket, American and French forces faced bitter German resistance across flooded plains and broken winter terrain. There, the mobility of the Hellcat once more proved decisive. Able to traverse ground that slowed heavier armor, the vehicles provided rapid fire support, closing off avenues of retreat and smashing counterattacks before they could gain momentum. Each new engagement added to the Hellcat's reputation. It was not a weapon suited only for one environment, nor a novelty confined to a single campaign. Instead, across valleys, forests, towns, and plains, it performed as doctrine demanded: ambush, strike, withdraw, and repeat. German commanders learned to dread its presence, recognizing that their carefully prepared thrusts could unravel the moment these agile tank destroyers entered the fight. Among the rank and file, stories spread of phantom tanks that arrived where none should have been, reinforcing the mystique of a machine that seemed able to bend the battlefield's rules. For the Allies, the psychological impact was equally significant. To the infantry holding tenuous lines, the arrival of Hellcats meant that German armor could be contested, that counterattacks could be blunted. Morale rose when these swift machines arrived in support, their very speed a reassurance that no enemy breakthrough would go unchallenged. By early 1945, the Hellcat had earned its place not only as a technical achievement, but as a symbol of how American doctrine and industry could reshape the dynamics of armored war. From the forests of the Ardennes to the plains of Alsace, the M18 had proven it was no one theater wonder. It was a consistent performer, a tank destroyer that turned speed into both weapon and armor. With each clash, it deepened the psychological divide, emboldening Allied soldiers while sowing doubt among German crews. The stage was set for the final campaigns into Germany itself, where the Hellcat would continue to play its part in dismantling the Reich's once feared armored fist. By the final months of 1944, the M18 Hellcat was no longer merely a machine of steel and gears. It had become a force inside the minds of those who encountered it. For German Panzer crews, trained from the first days of their service to believe in the supremacy of their armor, the experience of being outmaneuvered by a lighter American vehicle was disorienting. Reports from the Lorraine campaign and the Ardennes revealed not only battlefield losses, but also a creeping sense of uncertainty. Intercepted letters spoke of American hares darting across fields, impossible to catch, leaving heavy Panthers spinning their turrets in vain. Some Wehrmacht soldiers tried to cloak the shock in ridicule, mocking the Americans for relying on speed instead of armor. But beneath the derision lay unease. If these hares could consistently slip past and kill, what good was German doctrine built on frontal superiority? The power of rumor magnified the fear. In Panzer Grenadier regiments, stories circulated of Hellcats capable of racing across ground faster than trucks, firing on the move with uncanny accuracy. Some claimed they were invulnerable to ambush because they were simply too quick to trap. Others believed American factories were turning out thousands every month, filling Europe with swarms of these light predators. Whether true or exaggerated, these tales eroded the aura of German invincibility. For soldiers who had once believed their Tigers and Panthers untouchable, the idea that an American vehicle could dictate the tempo of battle was profoundly unsettling. For American crews, the Hellcat offered a different kind of psychological weapon: confidence. In North Africa and early Italy, tankers had often felt overshadowed, knowing that Sherman struggled against the frontal armor of German heavy tanks. With the Hellcat, they finally possessed a machine designed for their doctrine, one that played to American strengths rather than exposing weaknesses. Crews took pride in their ability to outflank and outrun, knowing they could strike where the Germans least expected. This confidence did not erase the danger. Every Hellcat crew knew that a single hit could end them, but it gave them a sense of agency, the belief that skill, daring, and teamwork could prevail. That sense of speed-driven empowerment spread beyond the tank destroyer battalions. To Allied infantry, the appearance of Hellcats on the line was a source of reassurance. Soldiers pinned down by the threat of enemy armor found morale restored when Hellcats appeared, dashing into position and unleashing their 76mm firepower. In Bastogne, in Alsace, and across the Rhine, men on the ground came to see these vehicles as guardians, proof that German armor would not roll unopposed through their lines. The Hellcat was not simply a destroyer of tanks. It was a visible embodiment of Allied resilience, arriving quickly, striking hard, and then vanishing before German fire could pin it down. Civilians, too, remembered the psychological impression. In towns newly liberated from occupation, villagers remarked on the open-top turrets and the blur of motion as Hellcats passed through. To them, these machines seemed to symbolize momentum itself, the visible proof that the tide of war had turned. Where once German convoys had rumbled with oppressive weight, now American columns surged forward with a swiftness that felt unstoppable. The Hellcat's speed became part of the narrative of liberation, tied not only to battles, but to the broader sense of inevitability in Allied victory. Beyond individuals, the vehicle's psychological impact rippled into the larger perception of American power. German intelligence officers, studying reconnaissance photographs of Detroit's vast factories, concluded grimly that even if the Hellcat's design had flaws, its sheer availability made it formidable. For Allied soldiers, that same industrial abundance reinforced belief in their cause. They fought knowing their machines were not rare, fragile treasures, but part of an arsenal that could outlast any German counterstroke. The result was a dual effect. German confidence, once anchored in the superiority of their Panzers, eroded in the face of an enemy that refused to fight by old rules. At the same time, Allied morale surged, buoyed by a machine that exemplified speed, ingenuity, and overwhelming production. Yet this psychological advantage did not erase the risks. The Hellcat's thin armor and open turret remained an ever-present danger. a reminder that courage and doctrine were still essential to survival. In the next phase of the war, those limitations would be tested as severely as the strengths, forcing crews to confront both the promise and the peril of the fastest tank destroyer ever fielded. By the winter of 1944-45, the M18 Hellcat had moved beyond being a novelty. It was shaping how American commanders conceived of armored combat itself. At Arracourt in Lorraine, its sudden flanking strikes against German Panthers had validated the theory that speed could disrupt even the most carefully planned offensive. At Bastogne, its ability to shift across threatened sectors in snow and ice allowed the 101st Airborne Division to resist overwhelming odds until relief arrived. And in Alsace, during the reduction of the Colmar pocket, its nimble maneuvers over broken winter terrain proved once again that this machine could deliver results where heavier tanks faltered. Each of these battles carried tactical lessons, but together they revealed a broader truth. The Hellcat was changing the tempo of the war. American commanders quickly recognized that the presence of Hellcat battalions gave them options that had not existed earlier in the conflict. Infantry divisions, once vulnerable to the sudden hammer blows of German armored thrusts, could now rely on attached Hellcat units to blunt or delay those attacks. This meant that Shermans, valuable as the workhorse of the U.S. Army, could be used more offensively, pressing attacks rather than being held back in fear of counterstrikes. The effect cascaded through planning. Divisions equipped with Hellcats gained a degree of flexibility, able to redeploy at a pace the Germans could not match, and thereby forcing the Wehrmacht to fight on American terms. German commanders noticed the shift. After-action reports from the 5th Panzer Army and others lamented that breakthroughs, once the hallmark of German operational art, were increasingly fleeting. Where once a Panzer division could rip a gap through Allied lines and expand it before reserves arrived, now mobile American counterattacks, often spearheaded by Hellcats, snuffed out momentum before it could build. The very psychological edge that had made Blitzkrieg so devastating in 1940 was slipping away. Instead of dictating the pace, German armor found itself reacting. Harried by foes that refused to stand still long enough to be crushed. This was the tactical level, but the strategic consequences rippled further. The Hellcat's speed amplified the flexibility of entire American armies. U.S. forces could respond to German thrusts with speed and precision, moving units into threatened zones faster than the Wehrmacht anticipated. Combined with artillery that blanketed advance routes and air power that prowled the skies, the Hellcat fit seamlessly into a larger system of destruction. It was rarely decisive alone, but in tandem with these other arms, it ensured that German offensives could not regain their old rhythm. A Luftwaffe strike might ground Allied planes for a day, or bad weather might slow artillery spotting, but the Hellcats could still maneuver on the ground, buying time until overwhelming strength could be brought to bear. The doctrine was proving itself under fire. Tank Destroyer Command had argued that mobility, not armor, would be the key to countering enemy armor, and the battlefield results bore that out. At Bastogne, German attempts to encircle the town foundered not only because of paratrooper grit, but also because Hellcats ensured the defenders could resist armored assaults. At Colmar, French and American infantry advanced with greater confidence, because mobile American firepower kept German counter-thrusts from developing. These victories underscored a truth that German commanders admitted in private. Their armored spearheads no longer dictated outcomes. The operational initiative was slipping away battle by battle, yet the Hellcat was not a miracle weapon. Commanders and crews alike understood its limits. Its armor was so light that even a lucky strike from a German half-trax gun could prove fatal. Its open-top turret left men exposed to airbursts and snipers. Every Hellcat destroyed was a reminder that speed alone did not guarantee survival. Success demanded discipline, coordination, and a willingness to gamble, racing into positions where a slower or less confident crew would hesitate. Still, when viewed as part of the broader Allied system, the Hellcat's contribution was unmistakable. It allowed American forces to offset German advantages, turning mobility and industrial capacity into weapons as decisive as any gun. By early 1945, the strategic picture was clear. The Wehrmacht's era of armored dominance had ended. The United States, once scrambling to catch up, now dictated the pace of battle. And the Hellcat, with its lean frame and blistering speed, stood as a symbol of how doctrine and production could combine to neutralize even the most feared machines of the Reich. The M18 Hellcat entered battle as a predator built on speed, but its very design carried vulnerabilities that could never be ignored. Every crewman who climbed into its thinly plated hull understood the bargain: agility instead of armor. At just 25 millimeters on the glacis, and scarcely half that on the sides, the Hellcat offered little resistance against enemy fire. Even light German weapons, from autocannons on armored cars to high-velocity rounds from half-tracks, could slice through its frame. Artillery fragments raining from above were just as deadly. A single well-placed shot, a stray shell or even a burst of shrapnel could turn the Hellcat into a burning wreck within seconds. The open-top turret compounded these dangers. Exposed to airbursts, mortars, and small arms fire from elevated positions, crews often described the feeling of fighting with the sky itself as a constant threat. In winter, snow blew directly into the fighting compartment, causing frostbite and numbing fingers that struggled to load shells. In summer, sunstroke and dehydration afflicted crews as they baked inside steel that offered no shelter. Grenades and Molotov cocktails hurled from upper floors in towns or villages made urban combat especially perilous, turning city streets into killing grounds where the Hellcat's chief advantage, mobility, was restricted. These weaknesses were not abstract. German ambushes occasionally destroyed entire Hellcat platoons before they could respond. In the constricted lanes of villages or the forested tracks of the Ardennes, speed was nullified. Their Panthers and hidden 75mm guns punished the M18 mercilessly, forcing U.S. commanders to refine how the tank destroyer was employed. Doctrine adapted quickly. Hellcats were never to fight head-on unless no alternative existed. Instead, they were to coordinate ambushes of their own, firing from concealed positions, relocating before counterfire could arrive, and working in tandem with artillery and infantry. This tactical dance, strike, vanish, strike again, was both the strength and the burden of Hellcat crews. Survival depended not only on the vehicle's design, but on the nerves and discipline of the men inside. Maintenance, too, presented its challenges. The very engine that made the Hellcat a marvel, the 400-horsepower Continental R975, was a high-performance machine that demanded careful upkeep. In dusty conditions, filters clogged quickly. On long advances, mechanics had to work tirelessly to prevent overheating or breakdowns. Spare parts were abundant thanks to America's production system, but keeping Hellcats in peak condition required skill and diligence. Without such care, the same speed that saved lives could vanish in a mechanical failure at the worst possible moment. Crews themselves sought ways to mitigate the risks. Improvisation was common. Sandbags were piled onto hulls, spare track links welded to the sides, anything to give even a sliver of protection against enemy fire. Yet every pound of added weight reduced the Hellcat's one great advantage. Some commanders tolerated these modifications, but most cautioned against them, reminding crews that armor would never be their salvation. The best defense remained motion, terrain, and coordination with the broader combined arms system. As the Allies pressed into Germany in early 1945, these lessons were carried forward. The Hellcat spearheaded river crossings, hunted stragglers of retreating Panzer divisions, and continued to serve as a mobile shield for infantry. But the number of armored duels diminished. German industry, battered by bombing and shortages, could no longer field tanks in the numbers of 1943 or 1944. Increasingly, the Hellcat fought not against Panthers in their hundreds, but against scattered remnants, rearguard ambushes, and desperate pockets of resistance. Its vulnerabilities remained as sharp as ever, but the strategic balance had shifted so far that the risk was less pressing than before. In this way, the Hellcat story became one of triumph, tempered by caution. It had fulfilled the doctrine that created it, proving that speed could indeed serve as a shield. Yet it also revealed the limits of such a gamble. Mobility alone could not erase the dangers of thin armor, nor could innovation fully remove the human cost. By war's end, the M18 Hellcat was measured not only in the number of German tanks it destroyed, but in the tactical lessons it left behind, lessons that would shape the next generation of armored design. When the final M18 Hellcat rolled off Buicks, Flint assembly line in October 1944, its wartime career was far from over. Though only 2,507 were built, their influence extended well beyond the battlefields of Italy, France, and Germany. In the immediate post-war years, hundreds of Hellcats were transferred to Allied nations under American military assistance programs. Taiwan fielded them into the 1960s, while Yugoslavia, a nation balancing between East and West during the Cold War, kept them in service for decades. In these armies, the Hellcat remained what it had been in Europe, a swift and agile machine prized less for its armor than for the tactical flexibility it offered. But the Hellcat's true legacy lay not just in its steel but in its ideas. It represented one of the clearest wartime experiments in prioritizing mobility over protection, and the lessons resonated long after the Reich had fallen. US designers carried forward the principle that speed could rival armor as a form of survival. The M41 Walker Bulldog light tank, introduced in the early 1950s, reflected this lineage, boasting speed and maneuverability as central features. Even as heavier tanks like the M46 and M48 dominated American armored forces in the Cold War, the influence of the Hellcat lingered in the doctrine that emphasized flexible, mobile units capable of rapid redeployment. German veterans, writing in memoirs after the war, offered grudging respect for the Hellcat. They acknowledged that it had forced tactical adaptations even in 1944, a time when the Wehrmacht was already fighting with its back to the wall. Panther crews, who had once felt secure in their frontal armor, recalled the shock of being stalked and outflanked by a lighter American machine. These recollections underscored what had been apparent at Arracourt and Bastogne. The Hellcat was never just about destruction. It was about disorientation, the unsettling realization that speed itself could undermine the advantage of superior firepower and armor. The U.S. Army, though it disbanded the Tank Destroyer Command after the war, did not discard its central insights. Instead, the core lesson was absorbed into broader armored doctrine. Highly mobile anti-armor forces, capable of striking at the flanks of advancing enemies, remained indispensable. What changed was the integration. No longer would such units be separate commands, but their principles would infuse cavalry, reconnaissance, and later mechanized forces. The Hellcat thus served as both a culmination and a transition point, its service ensuring that the gamble on speed would not be forgotten. Historians later came to view the Hellcat as one of the clearest examples of American industry translating doctrine into hardware that shaped outcomes on the battlefield. It had been designed with a singular philosophy, mass-produced with efficiency, and fielded in a way that validated its theoretical purpose. While overshadowed in popular memory by the ubiquitous Sherman or the late-war Pershing, the Hellcat retained a special distinction. It was the fastest armored fighting vehicle of the Second World War. That fact alone, combined with its battlefield record, ensured its place in the lineage of armored warfare. For those who served in or against it, the Hellcat was a reminder that war is not only about raw strength, but also about the courage to innovate. It proved that speed and surprise could terrify even the most formidable enemy, that agility could serve as armor, and that industry could translate doctrine into steel with astonishing efficiency. In its legacy lay a lesson that reached beyond the war itself, that adaptation, even late in a struggle, could alter the balance of power. With the Hellcat story complete, the narrative returns to its beginning, the stunned disbelief of German crews in the mist of Lorraine. From that shock was born not just a battlefield reputation, but a lasting influence on the future of armored war. May 1945. Across the battlefields of Europe, the thunder of German Panzers had faded into memory. Where once they had stormed across continents, now only wrecks littered the roadsides, their hulks testament to a war of attrition that ground down even the Reich's most formidable weapons. For the dwindling number of German crews who had faced the M18 Hellcat, the memory was sharper still. They recalled the shock of encounters, where speed had stripped them of their assumed superiority. The Panthers and Tigers that had once inspired dread were suddenly vulnerable to a lighter, faster predator that seemed to appear from nowhere, fire, and vanish into the fog. For them, the Hellcat symbolized not just a machine, but the turning of the tide, the moment when the battlefield tempo slipped permanently from German hands. For American crews, the recollections were of a different tone. To those who had served in the Hellcat, it was remembered as both weapon and companion, fragile yet fierce, a machine that demanded courage and rewarded daring. Its thin armor never let them forget the risks, yet its blistering speed gave them confidence that they could face even the most feared German tanks with a fighting chance. Many veterans later spoke of the Hellcat with a kind of reverence, not because it made them invincible, but because it gave them a tool that matched their determination to overcome an enemy once thought unbeatable. The Hellcat's story remains one of contrasts. It was a machine as vulnerable as it was bold, open-topped, lightly plated and perilously exposed, yet carrying with it the ability to rewrite expectations of armored war. To German troops, it brought unease, disorientation, and disbelief. To Allied soldiers, it brought reassurance, momentum, and the sense that they could seize the initiative. Its presence magnified America's industrial strength and validated a doctrine that valued movement and surprise as much as raw firepower. Looking back to that misty morning at Arracourt in September 1944, when German confidence faltered before an enemy they did not understand, the lesson stands clear. Superiority in war is not always measured by armor thickness or gun caliber. Sometimes it is measured by the ability to adapt, to surprise, and to move faster than the enemy can react. In this, the Hellcat carved its legacy, not only as the fastest armored vehicle of its age, but as a symbol of ingenuity turned into advantage,